I unequivocally condemn these shameful acts that are aimed at the Jewish community. We must all continue to stand together against anti-Semitism. One of the things that makes us the greatest nation on earth is that people of every faith and background have the right to feel safe and welcome. We must preserve that and defend it, and my government will.
Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese there, speaking after an arson attack earlier this month on a synagogue in Melbourne that police are treating as a terrorist incident. And police in Sydney have also stepped up patrols after a car was set alight last week and houses vandalised with anti-Israel graffiti. The city's east is home to one of Australia's largest Jewish communities. The federal government has set up a police task force to investigate the series of attacks. Well, our next guest believes Australia is seeing a surge in anti-Semitism and that a comment from the Prime Minister that the issue has, quote, been around for a long time was, in her view, shockingly dismissive. Joining us now is Georgina, CEO of the Robert Menzies Institute at the University of Melbourne. Georgina, thanks so much for joining us. You've been writing that Australia's reputation has been tainted by anti-Semitism. How has the government's response fallen short in your view?
Well, the government's response has fallen significantly short because we see, rather than a decrease in anti-Semitic attacks over the past few months, when the government has apparently been making a lot of noise about how much it condemns it, we've seen a huge increase. We've seen a Member of Parliament's office attacked here in Melbourne. Obviously, as you mentioned, we've seen the Adass Israel synagogue last week firebombed and 2 people almost lost their lives in that incident. Cars have been torched. We've had a lot of intimidation at university campuses. I'm based at the University of Melbourne and we've had significant attacks against individuals, verbal attacks and graffiti that is deeply anti-Semitic. There are people now who used to call Australia a safe place for Jews saying Australia is no longer a safe place for Jews. The criticism by the Israeli government, of course, is that Australia is now not a safe place for Jews. And I find this, it's absolutely unacceptable that Australia, a country that prides itself on its multiculturalism, on its tolerance, that has been a home, a safe place for Holocaust survivors to flee to in the first half of the 20th century, has now become a place where it's dangerous if you're a Jew.
Well, the Israel-Palestine question is obviously an extremely polarising one and it generates some emotion on both sides. And Australia is facing an election next year. To what degree do you feel the government's response has been formulated with that upcoming election in mind?
I think the government is thinking very much about the election and the electoral consequences, and that's deeply disappointing. The government should be leading Australia for the long term, not just for short-term political gain. Governments in the past in Australia have traditionally taken a positive view of the status of Israel and have been supportive of the status of Israel. But this government has taken quite a different view and has departed quite significantly from a traditional bipartisan approach. And that has been feeding a sense that Australia is not a place where Jews can call it a safe place for home. So I think there is a lot of domestic political thinking around the government's strategy here, and that sends a really, really depressing message for Jews living here.
Well, part of what catalysed this was Australia voting for the UN resolution demanding Israel end its occupation of the Palestinian territories, which was a change in stance. But it's not hard to imagine the alternative scenario where Australia didn't vote for that. We'll probably be having a different conversation on the same subject, just from a different perspective with potentially similar results. So how does the government strike the balance?
Well, the government's past have been able to strike a balance. Of course, it's right to call out breaches of international law, but it should be done in a consistent way. The government at the moment is picking out Israel for condemnation, while at the same time not picking out countries who are equally, caught up in conflicts where there would be questions of breaches of international law. So there seems to be a one-sidedness there. Also, in the past, the Australian governments of either colour, the Hawke government, the Howard government, the Rudd government, the Abbott government, these governments of different political persuasions have stood by Israel at the United Nations, and we're seeing a significant departure here. And quite frankly, this is coming from domestic political considerations rather than consideration of how can Australia contribute best to finding solutions in the Middle East, and how can Australia contribute to maintaining and at the moment really trying to do all we can to rebuild social cohesion in this country. These conflicts are incredibly difficult ones for community members who have relatives caught up in them, but we don't want to see them playing out here in Australia, damaging social cohesion. The level of anti-Semitism and anti-Semitic attacks is unprecedented in Australia. We have seen very sort of small levels of attacks in the 60s, but the fact that now we have a place of worship for Jewish people, a synagogue firebombed, we have Jewish MPs, offices attacked, we have cars torched. This is not Australia. This is not the Australia we know. It's deeply concerning, and I haven't seen the government do much when it comes to bringing together interfaith leaders, building a case for improved education and historical understanding, which is so very lacking when it comes to the context of these disputes.
All right, Georgina Downer, Chief Executive Officer at the Robert Menzies Institute. Thank you so much for joining us today. Now, we have more on Australia ahead every Tuesday at 11:40 a.m. if you're watching in Sydney. That is 8:40 a.m. in Hong Kong. Plus, you can tune into the Bloomberg Australia podcast, which delves into the biggest stories shaping the country's role in global business. You can find that on Apple, Spotify, or Bloomberg.com.